In the history of humanity, few places have symbolized as much suffering and despair as the concentration camps of the Third Reich. Among them, Auschwitz stands out as the most well-known, yet also the most terrifying. Located just 43 kilometers from Krakow, Poland, this camp became the epicenter of one of the most horrific genocides ever known. From its opening in 1940 to its liberation in 1945 by the Soviet army, millions of people were subjected to indescribable suffering. The Nazi regime not only aimed to exterminate lives, but also implemented methods so cruel that even today, it is almost impossible for us to comprehend the magnitude of the pain and barbarism experienced there. Escape from Auschwitz. Escaping from Auschwitz was an almost suicidal mission. The Nazi concentration camp was designed to subject prisoners to extreme conditions of control, constant surveillance, and repression. However, despite the imposing physical and psychological barriers, some prisoners defied the security system and managed to escape, becoming symbols of resistance. These escapes, although few, have left a mark on history, not only for the cunning of the fugitives, but also for the importance of the revelations some of them brought with them. In 1944, Jerzy Bilecki, a young Polish prisoner, managed to escape Auschwitz in a manner as risky as it was ingenious. Arrested for his involvement in the Polish resistance, Bilecki was sent to the camp, where he quickly realized that his only chance of survival would be to seize any opportunity. At one point during his stay at Auschwitz, he was allowed to perform tasks outside the camp, giving him access to certain control points that other prisoners could not see. It was at that moment that he devised his escape. With the help of Mitek, a Jewish prisoner who worked in the SS control office, Bilecki acquired SS officer clothing, allowing him to blend in with the guards. Mitek played a crucial role in the escape, as she provided essential information about the guards' movements and the vulnerable points of the camp. After weeks of preparation, Bilecki set out to escape. On a cold morning, dressed in SS uniform, he headed towards the main gate of the camp. The guard, unaware, let him pass without asking questions. He became one of the few prisoners to outsmart the strict security measures. After escaping, Bilecki not only saved his life, but also helped alert the world to the atrocities being committed at Auschwitz. His testimony was crucial for later reports on the concentration camp. In 1944, Rudolph Höss and Alfred Wetzler, two Jewish prisoners, managed one of the most important escapes in Auschwitz's history. Both had been deported to the camp in 1942, where, despite the brutal conditions, they joined forces to plan an escape that would alter the course of history. Unlike other attempts, Höss and Wetzler's escape was not solely based on cunning to get out, but also on the need to make the world aware of the ongoing genocide. During their time at Auschwitz, both men observed closely the operations of the camp, especially the gas chambers and crematoria. In April 1944, after a long period of planning, Höss and Wetzler escaped through an improvised tunnel. To carry out the escape, they used an underground passage they had built over months without being detected by the guards. Once outside, they made their way to Slovakia, where they managed to deliver a detailed report on the extermination operations at Auschwitz. This report, known as the Höss-Wetzler report, was one of the first reliable testimonies of the atrocities committed at the camp and helped alert the international community. Their report was crucial in preventing further deportations, as the information it contained allowed many Jewish communities in Europe to avoid being deported to Auschwitz. One of the most well-known escapes from Auschwitz occurred in 1942, when Kazimierz Pieczowski, a young Polish prisoner, managed to flee the camp along with 3 companions. This escape was notable not only for the audacity of the prisoners, but also for how they managed to outsmart the guards by using the Nazi system against them. Pieczowski and his group stole an SS officer's car that had been parked in a restricted area within the camp. Disguised in SS uniforms, the prisoners pretended to be new officers sent on a special mission. They approached the main gate, and the guards, seeing the officers, opened the gate without hesitation. Pieczowski, a man with a strong character and great presence, used his cunning to direct the operation confidently, giving orders in German to the guards without raising suspicion. The group escaped the camp unnoticed and made their way through Nazi-occupied Poland. Pieczowski's escape remained secret for years. After the war, he became a symbol of resistance within Auschwitz, and his testimony was one of the most important in the years following the camp's liberation. A champion in the shadow of Auschwitz. In the dark and devastating days of Auschwitz, where human suffering reached unimaginable levels, some prisoners found extraordinary ways to survive. For Szalamo Aruch, a Greek-Jewish professional boxer, the boxing ring became his only means of salvation. Aruch, who was deported to Auschwitz with his family in 1943, became one of the few who managed to evade death thanks to his fighting skills. However, his story is also one of the most heartbreaking tragedies, as despite his survival, most of his loved ones did not share his fate. When Aruch arrived at Auschwitz, the SS officers, always seeking entertainment and ways to control the prisoners, devised a cruel method to further dehumanize the inmates, organizing boxing championships between them. The idea was simple yet macabre. Select prisoners who could fight and force them to face each other in brutal bouts, where violence was not only a spectacle but a matter of life and death. The losers of these fights were immediately executed or sent to the gas chambers, while the winners received extra food rations as a prize. The selection of prisoners was based solely on fighting ability, not on any moral criteria. Szalamo Aruch, who had been a professional boxer in Greece before his arrest, was one of the men selected to participate in these fights. Despite the extreme conditions of the camp, where malnutrition, disease, and physical abuse were constant, Aruch maintained a physical condition that allowed him to excel in each bout. According to his accounts, he fought in more than 200 matches during his stay at Auschwitz, winning all but 2, which ended in a draw. Despite being part of a brutal and dehumanizing system, these fights gave him a unique opportunity to stay alive. Aruch's story is particularly notable because it highlights how boxing skills became a survival tool, albeit at an enormous psychological and moral cost. For Aruch, fighting was not only a way to save his life, but also a means of retaining his humanity in an environment where death was the only certainty. His victories granted him a privilege that other prisoners did not have: more food, which allowed him to survive another day. However, the constant violence and brutality of the fights deeply scarred him, as it did many other survivors of the camp. When the Allied forces liberated Auschwitz in 1945, Aruch had survived the hell of the concentration camp, but at an immeasurable cost. His family had perished there. During his time in the camp, he never stopped thinking about his loved ones, who were victims of the same extermination machinery that tried to take his own life. Despite everything, Aruch survived, and his story became a testimony of resistance and sacrifice, a reminder that survival in Auschwitz depended not only on physical strength, but also on the ability to adapt to the most extreme circumstances. Failed escapes. Retribution in Auschwitz. Escaping from Auschwitz was an enormous challenge, not only because of the strict security measures of the camp, but also due to the severe consequences faced by prisoners when an escape occurred. The Nazi policy of retaliation, which required the execution of 10 prisoners for each successful escape, made any attempt to flee an act of desperation, with a human cost meant to deter others from following the same path. Auschwitz, one of the largest and most notorious concentration camps under the Nazi regime, was heavily guarded. Barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and constant patrols were just a few of the obstacles that prisoners had to contend with. However, the extreme conditions of hunger, violence, and forced labor drove some to attempt the impossible: to escape. In every attempt, the Nazis imposed exemplary punishment, aiming to send a clear message to prisoners. Any attempt to escape would bring death not only to the fugitive but to many others. One survivor who witnessed these reprisals was Francis Gayonik-Sek, who lived in Auschwitz between 1943 and 1945. According to his account, one of the darkest nights of his time in the camp revealed the absence of one prisoner during the roll call. The alarms immediately went off, and the SS mobilized all patrols to search the camp and its surroundings for the fugitive. After several hours, the officers failed to find him, but the retaliation was imminent. That same night, the SS colonel announced in front of the prisoners that 10 people would be executed as punishment for the escape. Francis Gayonik-Sek, like many others, knew what this meant: one of the worst possible punishments within the camp. However, what followed was even more terrible. The next morning, Francis was one of the 10 chosen to be executed. Instead of being shot, he was sent to an isolation cell, where he was condemned to die of hunger and thirst. This cruel treatment was frequently used, as death by starvation was considered a slower and, in a twisted way, more humane method for the Nazis compared to immediate execution. Despite the extreme conditions of the cell, Francis survived, which allowed him to be freed when the Allied forces entered the concentration camp in 1945. However, the personal tragedy of Francis was completed with the death of his family, who did not survive the brutality of the Nazi regime. In his testimony, he recounted how he felt trapped in a vicious circle of violence, knowing that any attempt to escape could result in the death of innocent prisoners, but with no other option to fight for survival. The Nazis' collective retaliation policy was a systematic tool used not only to punish those who attempted to flee, but also to maintain absolute control over the prisoners. According to studies by historians such as Gerald Reitlinger in The Final Solution, the rule of executing 10 prisoners for each escape was implemented to sow terror among the internees, ensuring they remained submissive and discouraged any form of resistance. Throughout Auschwitz's history, many escape attempts were made, but few were successful. Those who managed to escape, like Viktor Frankl, a survivor and author of Man's Search for Meaning, left testimonies about the tactics used to outwit the guards and cross the barbed wire. However, escapes were rare, and when they occurred, they were seen as a direct challenge to the absolute power of the Nazis, who responded with extreme brutality. Throughout World War II, over 1,000 people attempted to escape from Auschwitz, but many of these attempts were quickly thwarted, and those who tried faced a very high price. The Good Man, Compassion in Auschwitz. At the 1947 trial following the liberation of Auschwitz, numerous testimonies and accusations about the atrocities committed by the SS officers were presented. However, among the accused, there was one case that caught the attention of many due to its apparent contradiction to the nature of the Nazi regime. Hans Munk, a member of the SS who worked in Auschwitz from 1943 to 1945, was the only one to be declared innocent during the trial and was given the nickname the Good Man by the prisoners. Hans Munch was part of the camp's medical team, working alongside the infamous doctor, Josef Mengele, known for his cruel and lethal experiments. Despite his direct contact with Mengele and other SS officers, Munch stood out for his refusal to participate in the horrific selections that determined who would be sent to the gas chambers. During his time in Auschwitz, he steadfastly refused to contribute to the systematic murder of prisoners, and whenever possible, he tried to delay the death of prisoners by using his position to slow down the selections and prevent the weakest from being sent to immediate death. Although Munch could not stop the selections altogether, he made efforts to improve the living conditions within the camp. Survivor testimonies indicate that Munch attempted to improve the quality of food rations, one of the main sources of suffering for the prisoners. Though his influence in this area was limited by the Nazis' strict policies, his interventions were appreciated by those under his supervision. Testimonies from survivors, particularly those who worked with him or were treated by him, played a crucial role in his defense during the Nuremberg trial. Despite being part of the system that operated Auschwitz, prisoners recognized him as a figure who, amid the horror and brutality, tried to maintain a minimal level of humanity. This contrast with other SS members, known for their cruelty, was central to Munch being considered innocent of the war crimes committed in the camp. Munch was judged in the Dachau War Crimes Tribunal, and surprisingly, his attitude toward the prisoners and his efforts to improve their conditions led the tribunal to release him from any responsibility. He was the only SS member who received this exoneration, which caused controversy and confusion among those who understood the magnitude of the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. It is important to note that Munch was never completely exonerated of his ties to the Nazi regime, but it was considered that his behavior in the camp was not enough to justify his conviction. After his release, he lived the rest of his life in relative obscurity, away from the public eye. Despite his story being mentioned in various investigations about Auschwitz and the role of doctors and other professionals in the crimes committed in the camp, Hans Munch died in 1998 without ever being fully recognized for his efforts in the camp. His story remains a topic of debate, raising questions about the nature of disobedience within a totalitarian system and the degree to which human empathy can survive amidst barbarism. Scientific experiments in Auschwitz. The prisoners of Auschwitz were not only victims of systematic murder and inhuman conditions, but they were also subjected to a series of cruel and grotesque scientific experiments. In a camp where human life held no value, the Nazis used prisoners as guinea pigs for medical and scientific tests, aiming to develop new weapons, pharmaceuticals, and pseudoscientific theories. Many of these experiments had lethal consequences, while others left permanent scars on the survivors. One of the darkest aspects of these experiments was the active involvement of German companies, particularly Bayer, one of the world's leading pharmaceutical companies. While many of the exact details regarding the collaboration between Bayer and the Nazis remain unclear, there is documentary evidence showing that the company not only had access to Auschwitz prisoners, but also directly benefited from the use of prisoners for chemical and pharmaceutical tests. Bayer's relationship with the Nazi regime began before World War II, when the company allied itself with the Nazi Party, contributing financially to its rise to power. This collaboration continued during Adolf Hitler's reign, when Bayer and other companies in the IG Farben conglomerate, which included BASF and Höchst, profited enormously from the use of slave labor from concentration camps and labor camps. The IG Farben factories in Auschwitz, known as Auschwitz III Monowitz, were used for the production of synthetic rubber and chemicals, but also for medical experimentation on prisoners. The prisoners were taken to Bayer's facilities and other IG Farben factories, where they were used to test various chemicals, experimental medications, and other substances, with no regard for their well-being. Among the substances tested on prisoners were experimental antibiotics, vaccines, chemicals for treating skin diseases, and other pharmaceutical compounds still in early development stages. The experiments included testing substances like phosgene, a poisonous gas used in World War I, and ethylene bromide, a highly toxic substance. They tested drugs for malaria, as well as vaccines and treatments for typhoid fever and other infectious diseases. However, most of these experiments were not only ineffective, but also resulted in unnecessary deaths or horrific suffering for the prisoners who survived. A particularly well-known case involved experiments on female prisoners in Auschwitz who were subjected to tests for contraceptive products and other fertility drugs. These women, selected from the prisoner population, were forced to participate in the experiments under threat of death, and many suffered devastating physical consequences. Some were rendered permanently sterile, while others died from infections caused by unsterilized medical procedures. Bayer's involvement in war crimes wasn't fully acknowledged until after World War II, when the information came to light through investigations and trials like Nuremberg. During the trial, it was revealed that IG Farben, under which Bayer operated, was not only responsible for exploiting prisoners as labor, but also directly collaborated with the Nazi regime, providing resources for its scientific experiments, among other activities. Bayer and other IG Farben companies were linked to war crimes due to their contribution to the Nazi war effort and their participation in the exploitation and experimentation on prisoners. While Bayer, as a company, tried to distance itself from these events after the war, the legacy of its involvement in the Auschwitz crimes remains a topic of debate. The company faced multiple lawsuits and trials related to its actions during the war, but in general, it did not receive the same level of culpability as the key figures in the Nazi regime. The scientific experiments carried out in Auschwitz serve as a chilling reminder of the lengths to which the Nazis went to pursue their twisted ideologies, using human beings as disposable tools in their pursuit of pseudo-scientific progress. While the world condemned the atrocities of the Holocaust, the ongoing efforts to hold the companies involved accountable for their complicity in these experiments remains an important chapter in the pursuit of justice. Forbidden Love in Auschwitz: The Story of Helena and Franz. In the darkest period of human history, where the brutality of the Nazis seemed limitless, a story emerged that, despite its rarity, defied the logic of the laws and social norms imposed in Auschwitz. This is the story of a forbidden love between a member of the SS and a Jewish prisoner, one that transcended the barriers established by the Nazi regime. The story of Helena Citronova and Franz Wach began in an unusual circumstance: the celebration of Franz Wach's birthday, an SS guard. In the oppressive atmosphere of Auschwitz, where prisoners lived under a regime of violence and dehumanization, Helena Citronova was one of many prisoners who survived the cruel reality of the concentration camp day after day. As part of her duties, Helena, a singer with an extraordinary voice, was forced to perform songs for the camp's officers. On Franz's birthday, her voice echoed through the barracks, and according to reports, it was at that moment that he became completely captivated by her. Franz Wach, a towering man feared by the prisoners, was seduced by the beauty and melody of her singing, and from that moment on, he began showing her an extraordinary level of protection. In a camp where survival depended on the cruelty of the guards, Franz was an exception. He began sending her additional food rations, a small gesture that, though seemingly minor, was a luxury in Auschwitz, where starvation was one of the main methods of control. He also sent her several secret notes expressing his love for her, a love that was completely forbidden according to the strict Nazi laws that prohibited any relationship between Aryans and Jews. Of course, at first, Helena did not reciprocate his advances. In her situation, her life hung by a thread, and the survival rules in Auschwitz were clear. There was no room for emotion, only for the fight for survival. Despite this, Franz persisted in his courtship, trying to win her favor. He protected her from the violence of other officers and the brutal conditions of the camp, which, although incomprehensible to most, was a gesture that made Helena begin to see him differently. However, what truly changed her perception of him occurred when Franz, in an act that contradicted the camp's orders, saved her sister from being sent to the gas chambers. At that moment, Helena saw Franz in a new light, and although she was still cautious, she felt deeply grateful. As the Allies advanced toward Auschwitz at the end of the war, the Nazi authorities decided to evacuate the prisoners through the infamous death marches. These forced transfers meant that many people would die along the way due to the harsh conditions and the abuse by soldiers. Helena was transferred to another camp, and Franz, despite his apparent position of power, could not prevent the march, leading to their separation for years of suffering. For 25 years, Helena and Franz had no contact with each other. However, the story did not end there. In 1972, Franz Wach was arrested and tried for his involvement in the war crimes committed at Auschwitz. In this context, Helena testified in his favor during the trial, a testimony that surprised many given the nature of their relationship. Although their relationship had been one of stark contrasts, she, a prisoner and victim, and he, a Nazi guard, Helena, over the years, had come to forgive Franz. Her testimony helped him avoid a severe sentence, and ultimately Franz was sentenced to a light penalty compared to other SS officers. The Sonderkommando, the uprising in Auschwitz. One of the most dehumanizing and terrifying tasks in Auschwitz was that of the Sonderkommando, a group of prisoners forced to carry out the most macabre functions of the camp, the incineration of the bodies of victims killed in the gas chambers. These prisoners, often Jews, were not only forced to participate in the systematic murder of their fellow countrymen, but also lived with the unbearable weight of guilt and anguish. For many, being part of the Sonderkommando represented a fatal destiny, as they were considered unwanted witnesses to the regime's crimes, and it was known that at some point they would be executed to prevent the truth from coming to light. As the war progressed and Nazi Germany's defeat became imminent, members of the Sonderkommando began hearing rumors that extermination plans also involved them. They knew their time was running out. In late 1944, when the Allies were approaching, a small group of Sonderkommando prisoners decided to take the only possible action: rebel against their oppressors. In one of the most significant uprisings within the camp, on October 7, 1944, the members of the Sonderkommando organized an insurrection. Taking advantage of tools stolen from the kitchens, they fashioned knives and axes to attack the guards. They killed 3 SS officers and, as part of the rebellion, destroyed the crematorium with dynamite they had obtained by stealing it from the soldiers. Despite the prisoners' courage and determination, the resistance was quickly crushed. Several hundred prisoners managed to escape, but most were recaptured and executed publicly in front of the other prisoners to instill fear and prevent future escape attempts. The response from the SS was cruel and merciless, once again demonstrating the brutality with which the Nazis operated. Although the Sonderkommando uprising failed in its goal of ending the barbarity in Auschwitz, it became a symbol of resistance. In the history of concentration camps, few acts of bravery could match the scale of this revolt. The prisoners who participated in this insurrection knew they were facing certain death, but their courage and sacrifice left an indelible mark on the collective memory of humanity. Rudolph Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz. Rudolph Höss was one of the most feared and hated figures in Auschwitz. Born in 1901, he joined the SS at a young age and quickly rose through the Nazi hierarchy, earning the trust of his superiors due to his complete devotion to the ideals of the regime. In 1940, Höss was appointed commandant of Auschwitz, where he committed himself to implementing the most brutal extermination policies of the Nazis. During his time as commandant, Höss oversaw the daily execution of thousands of people. Under his leadership, the gas chambers of Auschwitz became a tool of systematic death, and mass killings of Jewish, Polish, Romani, and Soviet POW prisoners took place. Additionally, he was responsible for the construction of the extermination facilities at Birkenau, a process that involved the installation of more crematories and gas chambers to conduct mass murders more efficiently. According to post-war investigations, Höss was directly responsible for the deaths of between 2 and 3 million people. In his reports, he described the extermination process as a necessary task to fulfill the regime's objectives, and at one point he infamously stated that the enemies of the Reich should be ruthlessly eliminated. However, after being arrested following the fall of the Third Reich, Höss tried to minimize his involvement in the crimes he had facilitated. During his trial in Nuremberg, he argued that the charges of mass extermination were exaggerated and that only about 2.5 million people had been killed, claiming the rest had died from starvation and cold due to the conditions of the camp. Despite his attempts to evade responsibility, the evidence against him was overwhelming. On April 16, 1947, Rudolph Höss was executed by hanging in the very camp he had commanded, Auschwitz, as part of the justice sought for the perpetrators of the Holocaust. His execution marked the end of the career of one of the most ruthless commanders in Nazi history. The Auschwitz concentration camp remains an indelible symbol of the extreme cruelty that human beings are capable of. Through the stories of resistance, suffering, and survival we have explored, we can understand the magnitude of the horror that occurred behind its walls. The escapes, the revolts of the Sonderkommando, the lives shattered by violence and sacrifice, and the involvement of figures like Rudolph Höss allow us to see how barbarity fused with the Nazi machinery of death. Despite the enormity of these crimes, the stories of those who survived and rebelled remind us of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of the most brutal oppression.